Hello and welcome back to the 2023 Research Conference, Politics, Communication, and Polarization, hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue University. I'm Andrea Langrish, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Before we get started, please be sure you have your camera turned on so our speakers can see you and your microphone on mute. You'll use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion of the session. It is my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Kathryn Brownell. Kathryn is an associate professor in the Department of History at Purdue University. She was recently announced as senior editor of Time Magazine's Made by History column. She has published articles in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Reuters. She has also appeared on C-SPAN and MSNBC. For the past several years, she has been an active member of the Advisory Committee for the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Kathryn is known for her work on modern American political history, the American presidency, media history, and the intersection of politics and pop culture. She most recently published 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News, a thought-provoking and compelling historical analysis of the rise of cable television news and its impact on US politics today. This book has reached Amazon's top 100 for books in human rights and democracy. Join me in welcoming Dr. Kathryn Brownell.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And let me just share my screen. All right. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? All right. I should be used to this by now, but it's always great to double check. Thank you so much for having me and taking the time to hear about my new book. It is particularly meaningful to share the finished project with the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement, as Robert Browning and the C-SPAN Video Library have played such a big role in my research, as you will see today. And I would not have completed this book if it weren't for the support from the C-SPAN Video Library and the Lamb School. So it's truly such an honor to be with you today. In the book, I tell the story about the political battle over cable television, both how to structure it and how to use it. And the book charts the Democratic promise during the age of network broadcast television, as oligopolies really limited the type of information people received on their television screens. And eventually, how cable television emerged as a privatized medium, designed to disrupt and divide Americans as it tethered politics to profits. The book is very much about regulatory and legislative debates, as well as innovative and experimental approaches to using new media. And indeed, one of my main arguments, I think a contribution of this to the scholarship, is to show how deeply connected these two issues are and these two developments are. It tells the story of some cable legends who are well known, like the unpredictable Ted Turner, who launched CNN in 1980, or the calculating executive of TCI, whom Al Gore very famously called Darth Vader, John Malone. Of course, the even-handed and modern Midwesterner, Brian Lamb, whose vision for C-SPAN, as everyone here knows, brought television cameras into the chambers of Congress. Others are behind-the-scenes icons, whose reputations for innovation have made them celebrated cable pioneers. Or they might be lobbyists, like policymakers, like Clay Whitehead, who is here, who really transformed policy discussions about cable television under Richard Nixon's administration. He then used his experience in the White House, Congress, and the FCC to make it big in the telecommunications industry. Other men, and they were almost all exclusively men, really do shape the trajectory of cable television in very specific ways. And their ideas and their vision for cable caught the attention of television-hungry elected officials and citizens alike, with a promise that cable could launch a new type of democracy grounded in market choice. People across the political spectrum bought into this promise because they saw how cable could advance their own political agendas. President Richard Nixon saw an industry that could take down his broadcasting enemies. Al Gore envisioned a style of television that could hold the powerful accountable and, perhaps more importantly, could help boost his White House aspirations. Newt Gingrich reimagined congressional procedures like special orders on the floor of Congress at the end of the day to make himself a star with a small but very loyal national following. And Bill Clinton and Ross Perot understood how the cable dial could help them connect to a public that craved entertainment more than politics. Today, I want to point to three moments to show the ways in which regulatory debates about how to structure television were interconnected with the attitudes of these people and the ideas of these people, and how together they brought about a new approach to TV, but also a new approach to political communication. It really starts, and the research into this project, thanks to a conversation I had with Robert Browning 10 years ago, starts with Richard Nixon and the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, which I see as a really transformative and significant moment. So during the 1960s, the television landscape looked very different than it does today. As many may remember, but I am the resident historian, so I feel the need to set this historical stage. It was dominated by the big three broadcast networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, all of which aired limited programming that ended at certain times each day. This structure was by design because the dissemination of television happened over the airwaves. Local stations had to have a broadcast license to determine what part of the spectrum they could use and when they could use it. The FCC then allowed for a commercial system to develop in which these local broadcasters affiliated with one of the national networks to get higher quality programming to disseminate. In exchange for monopolizing the marketplace, the networks promised to serve the quote-unquote public interest. This concept was incredibly vague as to what it meant, and initially it was not taken very seriously. But by the early 1960s, thanks to a more active FCC chairman, Newton Minow, who lambasted the quote-unquote vast wasteland on television, network television newsrooms dramatically expanded, becoming the way that they framed their civic contributions. Today's polarized politics may inspire nostalgia for an era in which Americans got all of their TV news, and entertainment for that matter, from common sources. But at the time, discontent abounded. Many on the left saw a network culture steeped in racial and gendered stereotypes that news and entertainment programs tended to perpetuate. Conservatives felt ideologically excluded from broadcast television news in particular. One thing that people across the political spectrum could agree upon was the need for more television access to advance their political causes, and they shared a frustration with the power that the white male network executives had in shaping the information the public had about the world around them. Perhaps no one was angrier at this system than Richard Nixon. Many elected officials had very chummy relationships with broadcasters. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson's family owned a broadcasting empire in Texas. And so they were really embedded within this broadcasting relationship. Richard Nixon was not one of those people. Indeed, the 37th president blamed his political failures in 1960 and 1962 on television. And so, as he resurrected his political career for the 1968 presidential election, he worked diligently to control his TV image, hiring television producers like Roger Ailes as media consultants. There are many reasons why Nixon squeaked out a win in 1968 that have nothing to do with TV. But in Nixon's mind, the difference between Nixon, the winner in 1968, and Nixon, the loser in 1960 and 1962, was his ability to control his television image. And so there's an obsession with media politics that became a pillar of his presidency. He particularly fixated on what he called the quote unquote network news problem, which he understood to be both biased coverage of his administration and the fact that the networks had amassed so much control over information that Americans received. And so he worked diligently to upend the network television landscape that limited his control over his own message and gave so much power to these broadcasting executives who he truly talked about and saw as an enemy. That's where cable TV came in. Prior to 1968, cable television had overwhelmingly simply expanded the reach of broadcasting. Initially, it was called community television, or CATV, and it was just that, a way for entrepreneurs to deliver television to communities who could not access it due to distance or terrain. This, again, was also by design. Time and time again, the FCC restricted cable operations, limiting what type of programs it could deliver to those who paid a monthly fee. And it even closed off the cable system's ability to enter into television markets when it threatened to offer an alternative to broadcasting. But by 1968, reform-minded FCC commissioners, think tank researchers, and political activists began to see wired television, which technically could offer more channels than just simply the rabbit ears on antennas on top of a television that looked for broadcasting signals, that this could be a way to decentralize media and expand access to television. Some offered visions for nonprofit development of cable, while others thought about how government subsidies or a new deal for the information age could usher in the development of a wired nation. Nixon won the election, however, and he dramatically reshaped the trajectory of cable television by turning to market competition as the solution. He was able to do this because of a new office dedicated to communications policy that began under his watch, the Office of Telecommunications Policy. And for those of you, I know Robert and some of his graduate students have looked in this. This archive is incredible. If you're interested in any policy or regulatory debates with television and satellite and so much more, there's just a wealth of information in this archive. I cannot advocate enough looking at this. It's such an underutilized archival source, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well. So yes, Whitehead, who is the Clay Whitehead, or he goes by Tom, who is the head of the OTP, he wanted to bring a more free market approach to television, and he saw an opportunity with Richard Nixon. Because yes, he saw this opportunity to connect his policy to free market initiatives, but his main reason for embracing cable, Richard Nixon's, was to use it as a tool to undermine network newsrooms, who again, he believed were biased and out to get him. It was part of this larger war that Nixon was waging against the business operations of network television. He also threatened to revoke the licenses of broadcasters, which he had no power to do, and his Department of Justice even filed an antitrust suit against him. But the real dagger, Whitehead told Nixon, would be to encourage cable television's expansion as a competitor. It was a political calculation that Whitehead made. He was really passionate about decentralizing the communications landscape that was dominated by monopolies, and he wanted to encourage competition for new technologies like cable and satellite. He understood Nixon's bias, though, and so he presented the deregulation of cable as a way to address the network news problem and break down the social, political, and economic power of network broadcasting. Here's one of the really fascinating findings that I came across in the Whitehead papers. And it's what the OTP called Project BUN, or Break Up Networks. And it's an initiative whose very name shows how Nixon's media vendetta ultimately shaped the policies coming out of his administration. And it talks about this, that politically, economically, and philosophically, the network television monopoly is the central barrier to solving the news problem. And so the solution it posed was cable television. Nixon's approach changed the conversation around cable television, and it made clear that shaping the news was not just about shaping messaging or press coverage, but it was about policy that could then alter the business terrain of media itself. And that's why Nixon's ideas persisted even as he retired in disgrace. His contemporaries also wanted more television access that they too saw as central to political power. Which brings us to the second development, how cable leaders understood this, and they worked to recognize the self-interest that frequently determined legislative decisions. And they used this to their advantage to change the regulatory environment in ways beneficial to their pocketbooks. Nothing captures this development quite like this long trajectory of experimenting with congressional television that ended with the launch of C-SPAN in 1979. So the idea of filming members of Congress to gain regulatory favor went back to the late 1960s. Members of the National Cable Television Association, the main organization lobbying for the industry, they urge cable operators to offer free time on cable channels to local, state, and national officials, and they framed it as a public relations strategy. Here is a memo from Bill Daniels, where he's urging the embrace of cable casting as a way to gain leverage with legislators to give them then a stake in cable's growth. After Nixon's election, Bill Daniels pursues this idea that's laid out right here. And it's an idea of congressional television series in which representatives and senators would be able to control the narrative about the day's event, frequently like they did on local broadcast news programs. But this would cater even more to their desire for more control and more coverage. Such a plan never came to fruition, but you can kind of see here in what I have highlighted that the idea is that this could bring through, the goal of this is to bring through a significant and meaningful breakthrough in legislative relations. So ultimately, this fails to gain support in 1969, but this lobbying strategy persisted for the NCTA. During the 1972 election, the NCTA expanded what it called its political cable casting project, and it worked diligently to bring candidates to the cable dial. As candidates themselves were searching for ways to play these media games to win elections, which now increasingly is taking place on a primary trail rather than behind closed-door party meetings. This control and this free access was incredibly appealing. But I argue in my research that it took another dramatic television event, the televised Senate hearings on Watergate the following year, to make Congress really rethink the necessity of expanding its own television coverage. The Watergate hearings were transformative for the Senate, as television seemingly offered a way to bring more transparency and accountability to the political process, and to balance out the political power of a president who had a televised bully pulpit. And so in the aftermath of Watergate, Congress studied how to expand its television presence. And there is a key person who shaped the way the cable industry thought about this. Thanks to Brian Lamb, who had worked in the OTP. And then there's an interesting part of his career that I don't think is covered a lot, but I found really fascinating, is that he worked covering regulatory and legislative debates for a cable television trade magazine, and frequently was a thorn in the thigh of both the Ford and the Carter administration, because he kept calling out their like these lobbying strategies and why they kept backing down to the broadcast lobbyists. And he was completely exactly right. And so it's really interesting to see that they were frustrated because he was so accurate in some of his reporting. But Brian Lamb intimately understood that substantial legislative changes could come with the power to help in the re-election process, and that could make a difference in long-range government decisions about the cable industry. And he sold the idea of C-SPAN, which of course, cable cable corporations were funded. He got to fund as a project for the public interest. He sold it by saying that if you want to be taken seriously in Washington, you've got to do something other than entertainment and sports, and really related that the power of CBS, NBC, and ABC was through doing the news. The following year, CNN launched, and the NCTA lauded how CNN would also help the organization's lobbying efforts by, quote, moving cable off the back pages and into the headlines, which will provide, quote, credibility with our legislators and our regulators. It didn't take long for cable television and this nonstop coverage of public affairs to change government operations and the political calculations of elected officials, especially in the House, which began the C-SPAN. C-SPAN began in the House and then moves into the Senate in 1987. The Senate isn't televised till later on. Ronald Reagan kept his eye on manipulating news coverage on broadcast television because, of course, that reaches millions and millions of people at the time. It's much more powerful than cable at this time. But a minority of a minority in the House were desperate enough for media attention that they were willing to take a gamble on a new technology. The allure of television access, even to a small audience of 100,000 or 200,000, intrigued a young generation of conservatives like Georgia's Newt Gingrich, who increasingly saw politics as war. This is another really fascinating finding that a colleague of mine actually stumbled across when he was doing research in the Gingrich papers, and it really led me to this archival source. And it's to give you a sense of how C-SPAN fit into Gingrich's broader political strategy, here are some handwritten memos from Gingrich in the early 1980s, where he talks about how the need to, quote, play games, which meant having no shame in staging spectacles through confrontation and obstruction. It's really interesting to see his commentary on the modern Republican Party right now as they are combating the result of embracing these very strategies as party tools. But in the early 1980s, he and his colleague, especially colleagues like Bob Walker, soon became C-SPAN stars with very colorful and bombastic rants at the end of the day through these special order speeches. Viewers likely assumed that they were speaking to a packed chamber because the camera focused only on the speaker, as you can see right here. In reality, no one was around to respond to the allegations and the attacks that Gingrich and Walker would make. And so people might think, oh, they're right. No one's standing up to challenge them. But in fact, the House session had ended for the day, and no one was in the audience. 5 years in, such special orders had become so aggressive and manipulative that House Speaker Tip O'Neill stepped in to do something about it. On May 10th, 1984, Bob Walker starts delivering this rant about transparency in government, really accusing Tip O'Neill for hiding, doctoring the congressional record. A lot of ethical charges are waged during this rant. And then all of a sudden, this is what viewers initially saw on the screen. But then when Tip O'Neill ordered the camera operators to pan the empty chamber, this on the right-hand side is what they soon saw. Walker was furious. It took about 20 minutes, and this is where the C-SPAN video library is so great. And I would play the longer clip, but I am limited in time. But it takes about 20 minutes, and you can see people start to fill into the room and hand him a note that the cameras are panning. And Walker is furious, and the panning move ignited a days-long partisan war that ended with Newt Gingrich facing off against Tip O'Neill, and the latter losing his temper and getting his words taken down in the House, which was a major penalty. Gingrich was delighted because people paid attention to what happened, especially the Washington press corps. He racked up all of these national media interviews that resulted because of the incident, and it then made him a junior member of the ideological fringe of the minority party more of a household name. It elevated his slash and burn political style and accelerated his rise in the GOP. For Gingrich, he saw media as a weapon and a battlefield, and he used cable as a political tool to take on the establishment of both moderate Republicans and the Democratic Party by stoking outrage. And it's a reminder that choices over how to use new mediums matter. Which takes us to the third moment that I want to really dissect, which is the 1992 election and what I call the rise of the MTV presidency. It was June 1992, and Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton's campaign was really struggling. I was floundering. While he had captured the Democratic nomination, his campaign was broke and trying to marshal resources until the upcoming Democratic National Convention. To keep Clinton in the spotlight without the costly television advertisements, his campaign accepted any media invitation that came his way. This included one inviting him to a town hall on what his opponent, President George H.W. Bush, would later dismiss as simply a quote-unquote teeny bopper network, MTV. The move proved brilliant. The appearance helped to generate buzz that helped Clinton's campaign truly regain its stride. One observer noted that he was, quote, quick, not slick, sympathetic, not condescending, imaginative, not wordy. The platform was perfect for the charming Clinton. A long conversational format allowed him to address the controversies from the campaign while controlling the parameters of the conversation. Doing so also allowed him to evade and then even criticize the more critical National Press Corps, which had focused relentlessly on a range of scandals surrounding him, from draft dodging in Vietnam to whitewater to smoking, but of course not inhaling, marijuana. And he was able to use this to question the reporter's very credibility. He really emphasized that he wanted to hear from the people, not this cynical press corps, and really tried to prioritize these questions that were coming out from individual voters. In the process, Clinton ushered in a fundamental change to how presidents communicated. Cable presented an opportunity for slicing and dicing the electorate and relaying different messages to different audiences. It's a targeted approach that represented a seismic transformation away from the strategy employed by great communicators of the past in both parties, like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, who really prioritized broadcast media of their day to craft a mass appeal, one that reached and courted as many Americans as possible. I think it's really important to think about broadcasting, the name of it, broadcasting. That's the goal, is to create this broader consensus, to appeal to a broad audience. Cable turns that broadcasting model on its head, enabling politicians to really eschew any consensus building efforts in favor of appealing to the quote unquote right demographics. It's a narrow casting approach that was about creating an intimacy between the viewer and the candidate that would then really build loyalties, frequently by stressing differences, how they were different from these other candidates, other lifestyle choices. It really fuses political communication campaigns with this notion of lifestyle and stressing differences. So from Nixon to Gingrich to Clinton, cable industry insiders, they welcomed politicians' use of cable. They recognized that it was both good business and good politics. While Nixon drew attention to the cable possibilities, the launch of C-SPAN and MTV's Choose or Lose were efforts to demonstrate the civic contributions of the industry during very heated legislative debates over regulations. Cable lobbyists could point to such programming as proof of why a deregulated media environment could deliver concrete benefits for elected officials. And that's one of the things I found so fascinating about MTV, is that in 1984, there's a major legislation that deregulates aspects of the cable industry, really eliminating local rate caps on what they could charge customers and streamlining the franchising process. Unsurprisingly, in the aftermath, rates go up. And Al Gore uses this as this key issue that really elevates his national profile. He rails against the cable industry repeatedly in 1992. It's one of the issues. But then his campaign takes advantage of the very programs that the cable industry is creating to show its civic responsibility to kind of navigate those attacks that Gore is waging against them. So it's this really interesting moment thinking about these unanticipated consequences. But by the 1990s, there's another business calculation, though. Cable market researchers frequently use the phrase that effectiveness means more cable. What that ultimately meant is that when channels specifically targeted to the personal interest of viewers, they generated more loyalty, which translated into even more cable consumption. And this is a message that they brought to politicians during things like, this is an event from 1984, which is called a cable television political workshop, where they're bringing these lessons about what they've learned in terms of business and advertising strategies directly to elected officials, their staffers, and their campaign advisors. And then what emerges, especially in the aftermath of 1992, it became clear with MTV's foray into presidential politics that political media could make more money. And so for-profit entertainment channels like MTV in 1992, and then later Comedy Central, and even things like channels like Nickelodeon, they built on this premise. Such programming helped to keep viewers from changing the channel. This is something that MTV's executives were very upfront about. They said, we don't want our viewers leaving our channel, changing the channel to then go to see the news on NBC or CBS or ABC. We want to keep them here, and we'll personalize the news for our viewers. Well, as scholars, we would come to see and to think of these more as echo chambers, as they would later be called. But they found out early in the 1990s that this approach was very profitable. So today, in the age of social media, such business practices, especially encouraging division and diversion, have flourished, frequently at the expense of nonprofit public service initiatives like C-SPAN, as we have talked about some of the financial challenges that C-SPAN faces today. I did not set out to write a story about Donald Trump and Fox News. Indeed, the title, that very long title, that was from the marketing department, not me. And then I started thinking about this book, during many interviews that I have given about the book. Journalists just assumed that I started writing this in 2016 with the relationship between Trump and Fox News. But indeed, like I said, I had started thinking about this project in 2013, especially while interviewing for my current position here at Purdue. But as the relationship between Trump and Fox News developed, their mutually beneficial relationship, especially during his during the 2016 election and during his presidency, and in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and all of the reports that we have seen about the very flagrant misreporting and misinformation that Fox was delivering because it was so worried about offending Trump and offending its viewers. I think that this shows that what happens when profit and power are put ahead of democracy, and the consequences of tethering the democratic process and democratic institutions to the metrics of the marketplace. broadly speaking, one of the things I really want to show with my work is how media and political values, they don't just collide, they co-create one another. And I hope that by understanding the power dynamics, the business calculations, and the personal motivations of the players involved can help people better navigate a political and media environment that is designed to distract and divide them. So thank you so much, and I am happy to answer any questions.
So Dr. Brownell, can you tell us a little bit about um, what kind of research you ended up doing specifically in C-SPAN to include any interviews that you did aside from the video library?
Yes. So one of the things I would first emphasize is how the video library has so much more than just legislative proceedings. And I can't emphasize this enough, especially I've seen during the 1980s and the 1990s, it has so many media executives. It has lobbyists talking about their lobbying strategy. This is not something that's happening behind closed doors. They're very open about it. And C-SPAN actually covers, because one of the missions of C-SPAN is also for this idea of media literacy. And so it really talks about the dynamics of how the media landscape is functioning. And so really interesting interviews with a variety of the individuals who are involved in leading these changes. Then I had the wonderful opportunity to go to the actual C-SPAN archives, which are at George Mason. And that is just incredible what they have there. One of the most exciting things that I found there are these viewer letters. There is this effort in 1984 to kind of celebrate C-SPAN's 5-year anniversary. And they launched a competition with its viewers to say, I love C-SPAN because, and then the viewer had to, respond in 500 words or less. And there's over 1,000, probably closer to 2,000 letters. And it's just really remarkable. I could just see an amazing digital humanities project that kind of shows the reach of these letters, because they're from what I could see, almost every state across the country, and really remarkable. The ways in which the people are kind of searching for community on the cable dial. And that became very clear by looking at these letters and how much it meant to television viewers. So that was really interesting. There are also a lot of letters that come in during the 1990s, viewers unhappy with things, really happy about things. It really depends. So you really get a sense of who's watching. And to me, that's a really exciting thing that the C-SPAN archive, the actual archive, presents as well. One other thing, there's this great, I know Robert has a couple copies of this as well, but in the mid to late 1980s and into the 1990s, there's a C-SPAN, it's called the C-SPAN Update, then goes into being called C-SPAN Quarterly, where it's also, again, a compilation of different, what cable operators are observing about their, the feedback that they're getting from their subscribers, and just a little bit more context about the programs and who's talking about them, how and why, the call-in programs. So again, there's just, you really get at the response, and that's audience responses are hard to get at, but this archive really makes it possible. Yeah, Bryce?
Yes, sorry for missing the start of your talk. My lab has a meeting at like 4:30, and so I really did not. I wanted to try to quickly touch base with them before we adjourned until November. And so the question that I have is related to, so earlier on today, Peter Kiley was talking about kind of the challenges of C-SPAN as a network transitioning to this different environment. And so, I'm assuming that the sorts of things that he's talking about is just kind of cable TV in general. And what's interesting about what he was mentioning was just this idea of like, how do you maintain the brand that is C-SPAN while pivoting to these other platforms? And so I guess my question is related to, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, major news networks. What is it about their brand that made it easy for them to kind of pivot so easily into this like media environment where, it's it's more fractious, et cetera. I mean, was it something where these networks just had like, from the start that was their brand, or was it more just like they just said, hey, this is where the media landscape is going, and they just kind of made this Faustian type bargain to kind of lean in one direction, and that was just kind of what their corporate, maybe the corporate sponsors or whatever asked them to do. So I'm just kind of curious how they kind of dealt with branding in this changing landscape.
Yeah, it's such a great question. One of the things that's really interesting, so CNN comes on the scene in 1980, and then it's not until 1986 that you get MSNBC and Fox. And what's really fascinating, and this again I found by looking through the C-SPAN video library, there are a lot of discussions about the state of TV news in the late 1990s. And it's interesting in those discussions, all of a sudden, Roger Ailes is talking about the news as brand, like this idea that we have to have a take on the news in order to kind of compete and find our niche audience. And so MSNBC wanted to really target younger audiences. And so they're partnering with Microsoft, emphasizing it's this younger demographic that they're imagining that's more technologically savvy, that can, kind of tune in or dial up at that time, I guess, to, the internet and give their responses to that as well. Where Fox from the beginning is identifying a conservative audience. It's very explicit. Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes have a vision for this conservative audience. And so I think that's one of the interesting things, is that how the news emerges as a brand. And then as they're trying, they experiment. MSNBC we now think of as, more left wing, and there are some progressive shows, Rachel Maddow, but that they experimented with a lot of different brands to try to kind of build up that audience loyalty. And one of the really, the things that you could see that the Trump administration provided a lot of crises, and cable news tended to flourish during times of crisis because people were glued into it. They wanted to know, and they got kind of sucked in. And then as it becomes, they're understanding the crisis from it becomes more about their lifestyle choice, right? It says a lot about their lifestyle and their politics, what channel they watch. They're not just getting information, they're connecting to that community. I think they were able to tap into that as well. So, because Fox, of course, is making money, not just on advertising, but on carriage fees. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. Of course, C-SPAN is affected by that shifting business model that they were getting a per subscriber amount. But so too are these carriage fees. When they're declining, that means that these cable networks have to really just rely more on subscribers. And that means that loyalty becomes even more important. And I think that you could that's the challenge that you could see with all of like the Dominion lawsuit with Fox, is that they were petrified of offending their viewers and offending the most important viewer, of course, Donald Trump. And so I think that's, where they go, I have no idea. Part of me wants, I hope companies like Comcast understand that C-SPAN was so important in their success, and remember that. But it's also a major corporation that's out for money. So who knows?
Can I just ask one quick follow-up? Because that's just really fascinating, because I would consider myself a 90s child. I wasn't born in the 90s, but I remember like all my fond memories are like from the 90s. And so this idea that, like, I guess I just take it for granted that media is a brand. And so that when you said that there's like these discussions on C-SPAN where they're like actually talking about it, articulated as a brand, that's really fascinating to me. So I'm not asking you to say like this is the time when this happened, but do you feel as though this was like not always the case? So, in the 50s, 60s, et cetera, that news organizations didn't really really feel as though they were kind of brands, and that this was much more of a more recent phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that you have, CBS really relies on Walter Cronkite, right? And the personal connection that people felt with someone like Walter Cronkite. And so they kind of relied more on that intimacy. But and in hopes that people like Cronkite, so they're going to turn on CBS News. But the content that they're delivering is very similar across ABC, NBC, and CBS, the actual content. So it might shift in terms of what celebrity anchor is delivering it and who you trust in your home, but the content is not seen as branded as much as what you have with cable, with the introduction of new channels on the cable dial. They all have a particular, like they're thinking we need to appeal to women, we need to appeal to Black audiences, we need to, I mean, the idea of a C-SPAN junkie, right? Like that actually emerges pretty early on, and I think people in DC were very proud of that, to kind of say, oh, I'm really passionate about politics and I make up my own mind. Like that was a brand that said something about who they were as well. And so again, it's all about these niche audiences and getting them to see cable consumption as part of their lifestyle and political identity. And so that really does accelerate. I mean, I think that's very much a product, that's something that drives our current media landscape, and that's something that cable really ushers in.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, like it's yeah, I don't know, you blew my mind with your references to C-SPAN. Just because, like I said, I take all of these things for granted. I mean, that's the benefit of being a historian, is that you have a longer time perspective than I do. So it's like I always think of like the last like couple of years.
Like I mean, the limits of network television. Imagine only having 22 minutes to consume your news on TV. That's all. Right. And it's very deferential to official sources, right? Like, so many people felt excluded. And when you see that, you can see that, yeah, people wanted change. And it's something like, the 1960s were a very divided and polarizing time, just like we live in today. But the one thing people could agree upon was the need for more diversity, more television access. My students are always blown away. They're like, wait, the TV day just like programming just ended? It's like, yeah, you couldn't watch it at 2 a.m. Like it blows their mind, like that's even feasible.
Dr. Brownell, do you think that we will ever see a return to normal, or not normal, but traditional TV programming as we had in the past, or will it all become content on demand?
I think it's all going to become content on demand. It's interesting. So John Malone, who I kind of talked a little bit about, he's a business executive, really, really effective business executive, really transforms TCI with very strategic business moves during the 1970s, especially in the 1980s. But he's really fascinating to listen to. Again, on the C-SPAN video library, this is where I got a lot of these interviews. He has this vision for this idea of personalized information on demand in the early 1990s. He's talking with, I end the book with this conversation he has with Walter Cronkite in 1998. And he says that the technology will get to a point where people can just sit down and get the news as they like it. They'll get the information as they like it. So he had this vision. And the reason for that is he believed the technology would come. He was an electronic engineer, so he kind of had that technological insight. But he also understood that this is a business demand, that people want things that are personalized and catered directly to them. And as long as there's this market, technology businesses will try to figure out how to tap into it. And so it's really, striking to listen to some of his commentary and his predictions, especially in the 90s, because it truly has come true.
Thank you. Well, I don't think we have any more questions, but I do want to thank Dr. Brownell so much for this great discussion on the history of 24/7 news and its impact on American politics, on pop culture at large, the fact that we were consuming media in a completely different way. So thank you so much.